Good morning and welcome to the BBA's webinar channel, where we discuss the latest issues impacting and affecting banks and regulated firms alongside subject matter experts in the field. My name is Philip Allen. I'm the Director of Learning at the BBA, and today, for the next hour to discuss cybersecurity, preparedness, trends and best practice, I'm delighted to be joined this hour by co-author of a new cybersecurity benchmarking study of 94 global organizations. Just before I hand over to Tony, who's the UK Managing Director of BRG, I'd just like to make you aware that you can participate in this webinar by asking questions. If you have a question for the presenter, you can ask by simply clicking Ask a Question button on your screen, which is located underneath the presentation. Please note that when you ask a question, your name and your organization is not disclosed to other webinar attendees. Points to note, we will be circulating the slides just after the presentation, and an on-demand copy will be available by the close of play today. So those people who can't join, or if you want the slide deck available to you, we will make that on offer to you. We intend to present for 40 minutes and then answer your questions for the remaining 20. Tony, over to you.
Good morning. Thank you, Philip. As Philip has said, my name is Tony Maroney, and I'm based out of London, working for Berkeley Research Group, which itself is based in California with 37 offices worldwide. In terms of today, clearly we have undertaken the study, and what I want to do is focus really in on that. In terms of the background of the study, you can read that later at your own leisure. In terms of the study itself, which is the most important thing, we undertook the study in Q1, Q2, and we compiled the results in Q3 of this year. 103 questions, took firms approximately 60 minutes to complete the survey, as it was quite detailed. Focused in on 6 key areas: risk management, essential protection, leadership, information governance, security culture, and incident response. And we'll get into the detail of all that as we go through the presentation. In terms of countries, 29 countries participated, representing 12 industries, of which financial services was particularly well represented. 44% financial services, with a further 13% in insurance. So in the round, you could say 57% of the participants were from financial services. Now, we did run the numbers and we looked at, well, was financial services in any way different from the rest of the industries? And the answer is marginal differences here and there, but nothing substantive. So, delighted to be here today to talk to you and share some of the insights from our survey. It's probably timely, given that the UK government has announced its own plan for the next couple of years last week, with a 1.9 billion spend behind it. And also that over the weekend we saw that there was a breach involving a UK bank, which impacted circa 40,000 customers. Now, no matter what way you look at it, cyber is evolving and it is an asymmetric threat. So what I want to do is, delve into the study itself, and hopefully throughout the course of this presentation you'll get some valuable insights. What I intend to do is cover a number of areas, starting with strategic insights. I'll then look at board and executive leadership. I'll look at managing security risks, systems and controls, governance and reporting, and then I'll finish with breaches and incidents. Some of the slides I will dwell on. Others I will go past at a fair pace because they'll be fairly self-explanatory, but as Philip says, we can take questions at the end. So, starting with the growing importance of the Chief Information Security Officer, or CISO. This is something that we can see it right throughout our study in terms of the importance that CISO has in an organization. 54% of participants in the study have a CISO in place, which is clearly a big improvement on where it would have been a number of years ago. And this is something that we believe has to be encouraged as organizations strive to protect their information assets and technologies. But I think what is really interesting from this slide is the reporting line. And this is an area that we think needs a lot more consideration. So we can see here that 32% of CISOs report into the Chief Information Officer, or the CIO. Now, we think these roles could be at odds with each other, in that the CIO is typically charged with keeping the organization running, and the CISO is typically charged with keeping it safe. Now, a number of banks have told us that they're trying to work through that and find a way that makes it work for both the CISO and CIO, but we think there are some challenges in it. In terms of reporting directly to the CEO, 20%, and the board, 12%. We think this is probably a good answer because it gives a more holistic perspective at the top level of the organization, and it also gives the CISO more influence. Worryingly, though, what we can see is that 32% of respondents are reporting in to people other than executives. So the question, I suppose, in my mind would be, is this form over substance? Yes, we have a CISO, but the CISO is so far down the organization that their ability to influence is probably going to be pretty low. Now, we did ask the question in terms of how many report into risk, and interestingly enough, only 1%. In terms of security culture, first and foremost, look, security culture is a mindset issue. And what we find, in all the firms we talk to is that they all talk about cyber being a people, process, and technology issue, but invariably they revert back to a focus on technology. Now, 73% of organizations say they have formal security training and awareness, and we can see from the two graphs, now it's the same information just shown in a different way, we can see from the graphs that where there is a CISO, there is a much greater focus and a higher degree of confidence in terms of security culture. And this cannot be overstated in any shape or form, because what we have seen, and we look at maybe one of the U.S. investment banks, where, and I'm not going to mention names of any firms today, by the way, but we look at one of the U.S. investment banks, they had a compromise which involved 76 million personal customers and 9 million business customers. They doubled their budget for cyber from 250 million to 500 million, and then a number of months later did a phishing attack and found that one in five staff opened the URL that otherwise could have taken down the organization. So security culture is fundamental to anything that a firm does. Now, in terms of effectiveness, I suppose, look, cybersecurity effectiveness needs to be organization-wide, but what we found was that throughout the survey, firms are not confident. In the main, if you look at it there, in terms of completely effective, 4%, and if you look at somewhat effective, in total about 24%, a bit higher for where there's a CISO as opposed to where there is not a CISO. Now, we can look at this in two ways. We can say, well, look, firms recognize they're on a journey and that it's evolving and they have a sense of where they need to get to. Or alternatively, we could say, well, actually, despite their best efforts, firms are saying, actually, it's still not working. And I think this is going to be a fundamental question for organizations at board and executive level. And already, the FCA is looking at the board and the executives. And I was at a conference there where I asked the FCA directly, and their view was someone in the boardroom at executive level is responsible for cyber. So I asked the subsequent question, which was, well, okay, under SMR, how are you pulling all this together? Because under SMR, in theory, someone has to be putting down on their responsibilities, statement of responsibilities, that they have overall responsibility for the cybersecurity effectiveness of a firm. So I'm just wondering, who is actually going to sign something like that? But that remains to be seen. We also know that the Parliamentary Commission is saying that on the back of their investigations that there should be a person in the organisation responsible for cybersecurity effectiveness, and the board should have oversight of this person and the ability to sanction. And they're going further than that and saying that 1% of the CEO's salary should be linked to basic breaches. So if things are happening that shouldn't be happening, the CEOs should be in some way penalised. And in the US federal banking regulator has come out and said, well, the board is responsible for cyber in terms of appetite, in terms of tolerance, and the approval of policies. So effectiveness is going to become a big issue as we go forward. Now, the FCA and others have said that it's a matter of when, not if. So, and we would certainly be of the view that, look, you can't build the walls high enough, because there's a lot of cyber criminals out there, and if they're going to have a go, they will have a go, and at some point in time they will get through. But it's the ability to respond that matters. Because if you can respond quickly, you can protect your brand, you can minimize the impact on your business, and then minimize the impact on your customers. But again, from the survey, we can see that firms are lacking confidence in their ability to respond, with only 26% somewhat confident and none completely confident. So, if you take it that firms are not feeling confident about the effectiveness of their program, and equally they're not feeling confident about their ability to respond, you can sort of say that, well, this is spelling trouble. Now, I'll use an example of a UK telco which hit the main news there last year, and they had a breach and a ransom demand. It impacted 4.2 million customers. Not all the data was encrypted. Some of the bank data was compromised. It cost the firm 60 million, plus it impacted on their share price. And the 60 million was 15 million in disruption costs and 45 million in exceptional costs. Now, the thing about this was that the firm, well, yes, they reported it quickly, which is positive. They weren't quite sure what had happened. And they originally said it was a sophisticated attack, and it turned out it may not have been that sophisticated. But the same firm had 14 breaches reported to the Information Commission Officer in the previous 2 years, of which 2 include vendor breaches, and we will come back to that. But what the Parliamentary Commission is saying is, look, if there needs to be escalating fines in their view to address threats and breaches arising from previous breaches. So if you've had a breach and you've learned from it, you should be better out to make sure that you don't have that same breach again. But if you do have the same breach again, they're asking some serious questions. Now, all firms are investing in cyber, and there's a range of initiatives. And as you would expect, risk-based security frameworks is a key one, and we'll come back to that later. But the main thing for me from this slide is if we look at the 2 red arrows that I have there, 10% of firms have a strategy for the Internet of Things, or put it another way, 90% of firms don't. And if we take that every financial institution that I talk to tells me they're digitizing their business and that it's a very connected world they're operating in. And if you look at the stats, it depends on who you want to believe. Gartner are saying by 2020 there'll be 26 billion connected devices. Cisco are saying 50 billion, and Morgan Stanley are saying 75 billion. But it's not just the connected devices that are within your network, it's all the other connected devices that are happening out there that your customers and business partners are interacting with. So it's kind of scary, and it suggests to us that what is happening is that firms are busy dealing with legacy issues. They're continuing to change and evolve their business models, but are not actually building in cybersecurity up front, which has, of course, the potential to cause a problem down the road. The other scary one is data, big data analytics. And it's 86% of firms do not have a strategy. Now, this one is particularly worrying for some of the regulators in that, one regulator was saying to me that they looked at a bank, and it wasn't in the UK, and it took the perpetrators 2 years to work their way through disparate systems and make sense of it. But if we say that institutions are now synthesizing all their data and putting it into one place, one breach can actually take down all of that information and cause serious problems. So I think this is something that we really need to look at in terms of where are we prioritizing spend in terms of cyber. Now, the board and executive leadership, are clearly in the spotlight in terms of being held to account by regulators, by the markets, by investors. And my own personal view is that cyber is a conduct issue as well, in that it has the potential to impact market integrity, customer protection, and competition. So I think this is one that boards really need to get their arms around. Now, in the US, the National Association of Corporate Directors recommends 5 guiding principles, which are worth recapping in terms of setting the scene for this in terms of cyber. So they're saying cybersecurity is an enterprise risk management issue, not just an IT issue, and we agree with that. That boards and executives need to understand the legal implications of cyber risks, and we're already starting to see litigation coming on the back of cyber breaches. The board should have adequate access to cybersecurity expertise and discuss risk management regularly at their board meetings. That they should ensure that the management have an enterprise risk framework with adequate staffing and budget, and equally that they identify and devise plans for risks to avoid, accept, mitigate, or transfer through insurance. So I think if you're sitting in a boardroom or at executive level today, you want to be very clear in terms of, what are your responsibilities, fiduciary responsibilities, and what are you accountable for at the end of the day. Now, when we look at organizations, we can see that, where there is a CISO, boards are more involved. But I suppose what really stands out for me on this slide is, of course, you would expect the board to be involved in security strategy, but where it really is interesting is only 1 in 5 boards are focused in on roles and responsibilities. So if you take the conversation we just had in the last 10 minutes or so, if the board isn't focused in terms of, well, who has what roles and what responsibilities have they, it's going to be very hard for them to make sure that they have a joined-up approach to making sure that they don't have a cyber issue in the future. And I think that any shortcoming in this space is going to lead to problems for individuals and boards collectively. Now, in terms of the board itself, clearly the board, all the emphasis is moving towards the board taking responsibility. But to do this, they need to be clear on the individual and collective responsibilities. And what we can see is that, the board tends to focus in on organization culture, which is good because we believe you have to get the culture right. The board is also focused on the alignment of security risk with the overall management goals, and that's pretty good. But the one area that I think the board probably needs to focus in a lot more is on the security incident response planning. And I think it's incumbent on boards and executives to sort of say, well, what if we had a series of breaches that hit simultaneously or in parallel? What would we do, and how would the firm be able to respond to it? And I think this is something that boards need to put a much greater emphasis on. In terms of oversight, we can see that full board, audit committee, dedicated board subcommittee, and 18% of firms are not quite sure. But I personally am in favour of a dedicated board subcommittee. But regardless of what framework or what committee that the organisation is using, your organisation is using, the key thing is around, are the right skills there in the boardroom or in the subcommittee? Because the board ultimately has to have responsibility, but to do that they need to understand what it is they are talking about. So big challenge there for the NOMCO. It is interesting that we are starting to see, we saw it with one bank in the UK there announced there last week, but we're aware that other banks have done it. They've put a dedicated panel of people that will work alongside the board or the board subcommittee to make sure that they're in a position to ask about cyber and understand the issues that they need to have dealt with. In terms of leadership and leadership support and focus, well, as I said, the markets are increasingly going to hold the leadership responsible. What we can see here is that how would you rate your organization's leadership support for security? Completely effective, 8%, somewhat effective, 36%. So I think there's a gap there in terms of what is expected and what actually is happening on the ground. And also when we look at the how you rate senior management focus on information security, only 13% see it as a high priority. So again, shorter where it would need to be. Now, in terms of feedback mechanisms, 69% of firms are relying on internal or external audit. Now, I would have a view that audit, typically is not necessarily forward-looking, but leaving that aside, there's questions around, does audit have the skills? There's questions around the sample sizes. There's questions around appropriateness. Because at the end of the day, I'm not sure the audit profession wants to hold itself out to be responsible for cybersecurity. So I think that's, if we look at it, it's the audit committee followed by the number of security incidences. It doesn't really equip the board to deal with the future, because it's kind of looking at, well, what actually has happened. And I personally believe that boards and executives need to move more to a proactive space where they're forward-looking, and that's really focusing in on areas like culture and awareness and industry benchmarking, particularly if you can get a relative benchmark score. So, I mean, if the Banking Association has its own benchmark, basically what you would say, well, look, here's how we stack up against all the other banks in our cohort. So I think we need to get more forward-looking in terms of how we look at it, and I would really question, is it appropriate to be relying on audit? Now, managing security risk. Well, the Bank of International Settlements have said that firms' cyber resilience framework should be consistent with its enterprise operating risk framework, and that's right. And the FCA is also saying that it's about making sure you have good governance around managing security risk, and what they're saying is around the ability to identify and protect key assets, detect, respond, recover, and it's also about information sharing. So in terms of cyber risk assessments, what we can see is that has the organization performed a cyber risk appetite assessment, both internal and external? Here we're kind of looking at the ecosystem. We're also looking at inherent and residual risks in terms of high, medium, low. We can see that 59% have, 35% no, and 6% don't know. And in terms of cyber threat assessment, and it's human and non-human, and it's looking at the ability to tamper, disrupt, interrupt service or items of value. Again, we can see 76% have, a much greater proportion when there's CISOs involved, and 20% haven't. And again, where there's no CISO involved, the numbers get a little bit skewed. But I think what is interesting is 47% of organizations do not believe that leadership has a functional understanding of their security network. So that's something that probably needs to be looked at, because it's if you don't understand it, it's very hard to take appropriate action to deal with it. In terms of documented procedures, well, this is good news in that 91% of firms have documented their cybersecurity policies and procedures, and clearly you need to document them, and that's positive. In terms of areas for improvement, as with most things, awareness, training, and communication are seen as critical to reducing the probability of a breach or limiting the impact should a breach occur. So people are very focused in on security and awareness training, and you can see there security expertise and capabilities, and communication and collaboration, all things you would expect to have. Now, in terms of executive briefings, this is one that kind of puzzles me a little bit in terms of if you consider cyber is very dynamic, very fast moving, but in reality what we can see from our survey is that actually executives are not being briefed as often as you might expect. So what we can see here is 30% are briefed once every 6 months or less, 36% every 2 to 4 months. But when you get down to in terms of frequency, 13% once a month, and 2% between once and twice a month, and 2% more than twice a month. So I think there needs to be the right number. Now, I don't have a particular fixed view, but I don't think it's appropriate that it should be 6 months or 3 months or 4 months. I think this is something that is so vibrant and it is so dynamic that boards and executives need to be on top of it on a much better basis. Now, there was a survey of the FTSE 350, and what they found was that 50% of boards did not discuss cyber. So that sort of begs a question in its own right in terms of, our boards kind of saying, oh, look, this is an IT issue and it's not something that we're comfortable with and we don't really understand it, therefore we're not going to discuss it? Or is it that, there's a recency factor? If it happens a similar type competitor, at that juncture, the board gets involved to try to figure out, well, what does it mean for ourselves? So we look at security and controls then. The most common standard being used is ISO 27001, 37% of participants in the study. But when we look at financial services, it's at 43%. Now, there are other frameworks in there, NIST, COBIT, FF, IEC itself, and a few others. In terms of control testing, we're looking here at the ability to identify, detect, protect, and respond to attacks. What we can see is that our firms doing this on a regular basis in terms of business continuity plans are tested. 10% strong degree, 40% agree. Many organizations are not testing them, though, on a regular basis. And this is something the FCA is focused in on in terms of firms need to be testing their business continuity planning around cyber. In terms of systems reviews, 24% of organizations do not routinely test security controls and business continuity plans on a regular basis. And over a quarter of organizations conduct systems reviews of interconnected systems every 10 to 12 months. In terms of self-assessments, what we can see here that, and these are important in terms of understanding the inherent and residual risks associated with cyber, we can see here that organizations with CISOs are more likely to have carried out a self-assessment than organizations that do not have a CISO. And the same is true in terms of external assessments. And I suppose what is interesting is that 17% of organizations do not routinely undertake external assessments, which is kind of leaving a big gap in terms of the organization's capability. Now, a real important area in today's world is the whole issue of external providers and vendors, because with the drive to take out costs, tap into fintech and do all other sort of things, a lot of outsourcing happens in financial services. And what is interesting is that on one level, organizations seek assurances from external service providers that they meet security standards. But that's all they're doing, because only 24% of participants actually go as far as to test that the data is to check that data is encrypted, and only 24% actually pen test. So it's one thing having it in the contract, but at the end of the day, you need to know that that's actually what happens on the ground, and that's the measure that the regulator will use. Their view is, look, you can outsource anything, but ultimately you have responsibility for how for the risks involved. So if you outsource it and there's risks there that you haven't dealt with, that is your responsibility. And if you look at the US, we had a major retailer. The costs involved were $162 million. They went in through a small firm in the ecosystem. They found they had the network credentials, that they were linked to the CRM and payments database, and the consequence was that 70 million customer records and 40 million payment cards were compromised. So this is something that clearly would create a huge problem. And the New York regulator is particularly strong on this, because when they looked at this, they found that 30% of financial services firms in New York actually had done very little to actually understand the consequences of outsourcing. And the FDIC in the US is basically saying that, look, if you want to outsource, you need to make sure your risk assessment processes are in place in terms of monitoring, in terms of business continuity planning, and in terms of testing. But if you look at this, you kind of say, well, yes, it's in the contract, but actually firms are not doing enough in terms of understanding is what is in the contract sufficient for them. In terms of governance and reporting, new study out only in the last few days in Australia from the Australian National University, and they're saying governance is the weakest link. And they're saying there's a considerable variation in terms of reporting and board level governance. There's insufficient executive knowledge, and there's not enough engagement in terms of government programs. So we can see in terms of organizations, 40% of organizations are neutral or not effective when it comes to rating their cybersecurity risk management program, which is somewhat scary. In terms of information governance capabilities, and here we're talking about design, implementation, maintenance of policies, procedures, systems to manage risk, etc. Only 4% of organizations believe their policies to be completely effective, 21% somewhat effective. But in the round, you can say 56% of organizations rate their information governance capabilities as slightly or somewhat effective. So you'd have to say a big gap there in terms of getting this right. In terms of governance maturity, IS governance maturity, half of the organizations are at defined level. And in here you're really looking at comprehensive policies, clear roles, reporting, tracking of critical issues, but not necessarily dedicated. Very few are in the optimized or measured space. And in terms of IT risk management maturity, again, 50% of firms are in the defined space. So again, plenty potential for improvement. Now, cloud computing is another hot topic, clearly a growing area with more and more firms involved in it. But 42% of organizations describe their cloud computing maturity as ad hoc or non-existent. So that's probably a scary thought. You might say, well, that's not the case in our organization. But it is coming through in the benchmark study as an issue that firms will need to deal with. In terms of government reporting, regulatory and government reporting, 57% of organizations in the survey have a regulatory and government reporting capability or requirement. And what we can see here is that in the main, firms are not doing too bad on it. But it is something that the regulators and the FCA has come out recently and said that, look, they want to know of any material cyber breach as a matter of priority. Now, in terms of breaches and incidents, in terms of where does the rubber meet in the road? What we can see is that 46% of participating firms have experienced a cybersecurity breach. 51% of organizations do not believe they are well equipped to handle a breach. So we go back to our earlier slides where we were talking about effectiveness and ability to respond. And we can sort of say, well, actually, firms are being hit and they're not absolutely competent. What we can see here is that virus and malicious software is the number one problem, followed by system failure or data corruption. Now, what is interesting, though, is that when we look at, well, what's the source of these breaches? We can see that current employees come out as the highest source, 45%. Hackers are at 22%, but former employees are at 13%. So if you take current and former employees, you've got 58% there. Now, this isn't all malicious. It can be inadvertent. So we talked earlier about the staff, 1 in 5 staff opening the phishing attack. But either way, if your staff are not tuned into what they need to do and understand their responsibilities, they can cause financial or reputational damage to a firm. And what we can see is, and if you look at the small chart on the right-hand side, the blue bars are CISO, and we can see that it's not that firms with CISOs have more incidences. It's just, we would argue that actually where there's no CISO, firms do not understand the actual sources of their breaches. So where there is a CISO, they're more likely to be tuned into where was the source of the breach. In terms of type of breaches, staff-related breaches, loss of confidential information, unauthorized access to systems or data, so using someone else's ID or something like that, or misuse of confidential information. So I know I went through that pretty fast, but what I'll do is I'll just pull a few key observations from it, and then what we'll do is have to go back and take questions. So, number one is that despite a strong focus on cybersecurity culture, organizations don't believe they're effective, and that is worrying. Current employees, most likely source behind cybersecurity breaches. As we saw there a moment ago, 45% of breaches are current staff, 13% former employees, and 22% by hackers. So in proportion, if you talk about where is it likely to go wrong, it's not that your employees necessarily are doing wrong things. They might inadvertently do them, but this underscores the need to make sure that the security culture of the firm is right and the governance that is there supports getting that right. In terms of where are the most common breaches, well, no surprise there, viruses and malicious software. And then in terms of the strategies that firms are adopting, disappointingly, 90% of firms do not have a strategy for the Internet of Things, and 86% do not have a strategy for big data. Overall, we can see that firms lack confidence in terms of their cyber security incident response capability, and equally, if we look at the response, in terms of the ability to respond, firms don't have confidence in their program, nor do they have confidence in their ability to respond. So that's leaving firms in a position where they could be on a hiding to nothing. And then the last point there is firms expect to increase their cybersecurity budgets over the next period. There are a few other slides here that I don't necessarily intend to dwell on. They will be in the pack for reading, in terms of things that firms need to look at. But in terms of recommendations, board and executive leadership and buy-in, absolutely key. Security culture, vendor protocols. If you're going to outsource, you need to make sure you're right. External audits, yes, external audit is important, but it's really around making sure that we're focused on the right things and that we have the right talent. Because if we don't understand what it is we're talking about, we're going to find ourselves in great difficulty in terms of dealing with cybersecurity. So I think they are all the slides that I was going to cover. Let me see now. Yes. So happy to take questions, Philip.
Oh, thanks. Thanks very much, Tony. That's very informative. We've got a question come in here. We keep hearing that cyber risk must be treated as a business issue and not as an IT issue only. What do you think is the value of the Chief Risk Officer in reducing cyber risk, and what are the key challenges CROs should be looking to address in the near future to ensure their organizations become more resilient against future cyber attacks?
Yeah, very interesting. I think risk has a big role to play here. And I think the Bank of International Settlements is kind of in this space, in that, risk is independent of the business, and it should be able to sit back and sort of understand, inherent and residual risks in anything that the firm is doing. I would like to see risk take a more forward-looking role in cyber, and to be actively involved with the CISOs in terms of how they protect firms. I thought it was kind of interesting when we delved into our own study to find out how many CISOs report into risk. It was kind of in the order of 1%. Not necessarily saying they have to report into risk, but I would have thought that a chief risk officer and a CISO working together hand in hand gives the firm a far greater potential to deal with cyber risks.
So the question is that CISO or not CISO, that is the question, isn't it? So
yeah, I think so. And look, throughout our study, and the full report is available. It's on the link there. But throughout our study, what we can see is that where there is a CISO involved, the awareness, the focus, the type of results they're achieving is better. And it's like anything else, I suppose, Philip. If you put focus on something, you're going to get better results. But we certainly are very pro organizations having a CISO in place.
Yeah.
And I personally would be very pro the risk function having a big role to do with cyber as well.
So in terms of like prioritizing and allocating of budgets, therefore, is that very much in the human factors or is that in the technology, software, processes and systems?
So there's a couple of issues. Firms tend to, when it comes to budget, most of the budget is still going on IT. We're not seeing enough being spent on training people, and I would have a concern that it's not about a sheep dip, as they would say. Well, we put everyone through a standard program in terms of cyber, so they've all listened to some program, whatever. It's not around that, because this is around getting the mindset right. But also there's this whole question of reporting lines. So if the CISO is not reporting in at the board or chief executive or the appropriate level within the C-suite executive, the challenge is always going to be around where is the budget and how is that budget allocated. Now, one bank was telling me what they have done is, because their CISO reports to the CIO, is they've said, well, as a simple metrics, 10% of the IT budget goes to the CISO. But that might be fine, but it may not be the right answer. So I would be saying that, look, it is around the organization being able to stand back and understand where it is today. And, clearly the study is saying to us is that, look, the focus is on dealing with the issues of the past as opposed to, well, we're continuing to evolve and change our organization, but we're not actually putting our money there in terms of cyber. So we don't have a strategy around the Internet of Things, yet we're digitizing the business. We don't have a strategy around, big data, yet we're investing heavily in data analytics and the ability to pull everything together into one area. So I think people need to stand back, and I think unless you have the people at the table who are kind of asking those questions, you're always going to get what you always get.
But yeah, still we have, according to your survey, 51% of firms still don't believe that they are well equipped to deal with a cyber attack on that.
Yeah, and look, as I said earlier, Philip, that might be fine if the firm is saying that, because they're saying, look, we know where we need to get there and we're on a journey and we haven't got there yet. It would be more concerning if the firm was saying, well, we're spending all this money, we don't know if it's working and we have no confidence. So it depends on the disposition of the firm in terms of their journey. I would hope that it is more the former, that firms have a clear view in terms of what they need to do. But only time will tell.
Okay, another question has just come in. Where organizations have had a more established information security framework and are now developing their approach to cyber risk, should the cyber framework absorb anything already in place regarding info security, i.e. is information security a subset of cyber?
Well, maybe we need to reverse that question out altogether. And is cyber just another risk that needs to be managed? So the question is, if a firm has a risk framework, does it need to have a separate cyber risk framework and a separate information framework, or should it actually have a risk framework that pulls all these things together? Because quite often technology is a way in, but it's not the only thing that happens in this world of cyber criminality. So I would come back to base points and sort of say, well, actually, we have a risk management framework, and one of our key risks is cyber. And in that, information security is obviously a key part of it. So I think it needs to come more from a holistic, as opposed to, well, there's our enterprise risk management framework, there's our cyber risk framework, there's our information security framework. Well, who's joined up all the dots on these? And I think when it comes back to, and I'm really curious to see how this is going to pan out. I think when it comes back to statements of responsibilities and apportionment of responsibilities, and when the likes of the FCA turn around and look at an organisation and say, well, we've looked at these statements and we've looked at the apportionality, and actually we're not quite sure, who's actually managing what in terms of cyber. I think this is going to become a real thorny issue, and it's certainly going to be a scary issue, because I wouldn't like to, if I was an executive sitting in a boardroom, being told, well, actually, you need to sign off on the behalf of the whole organisation that you have responsibility. I think that would be quite a scary place. But we're not quite sure what the regulator is doing, other than what they are saying is that the board is responsible and they are going to hold the executive responsible. So how that pans out remains to be seen.
Yeah, and I'm glad you touched on senior managers regime. It's something that the BBA has been watching very, very carefully indeed, and a number of banks are supportive of the initiative that Simon Hills, the BBA, is doing, informing us a working group to respond to the recent updates and the latest information that has been circulated by the FCA. And you're right, the senior managers have to take reasonable steps to find is actually making understanding culture, understanding that they have responsibilities. There's a duty of responsibility, as you highlighted in your statements and in your maps, which those banks, which senior managers basically signed up to on the 7th of March of this year. And so there is an absolute, the buck stops at somebody or some people in the organisation. Do you feel that that mood music from the FCA now has disseminated absolutely into banks and they get it, or there's progress, or there's a distance travelled from where we were perhaps a year ago to where we are now and potentially where we are going to be in a year's time? Are we going in the right direction?
Look, I think clearly we are. I think the proof of the pudding will be when the FCA turns around and they take an organisation, doesn't matter, any organisation, and say, we've looked at all your statement of responsibilities, can you give us an attestation that this is what you actually do? And then we're going to go in and test it. Now, I think when something like that happens, the statement of responsibilities will have a much greater degree of focus and clarity and understanding in an organisation. Equally, I think, if a firm has a breach and a report the breach, if you were sitting in the regulator's office, the most logical thing to do would say, okay, well, how did that breach occur and how was it not picked up on the statements of responsibilities or the apportionment of responsibilities? So where was the gap? So I think it's evolving, Philip, and I think it will become much sharper in focus over the next 12 months or so. Look, undoubtedly, all the gun turrets are pointing at the board and the senior executive, and they're not going to be allowed to sort of say, well, look, it was an IT issue. That's not going to wash with the regulator, nor is it going to wash with the investors. So if it's a quoted bank or insurance company or whatever, the investors are going to be looking to hold people to account for cyber preparedness and the ability to respond.
How does the second line really impact and make an impression on the board, on the ExCo, that this is absolutely a friend? I mean, obviously you have the news, obviously this week, of what's happening. You have the FCA coming out and saying that attacks have tripled or quadrupled there, and you have the government making a real statement of intent. The investment up front in cybersecurity training and development is as well. How internally do stakeholders, risk and compliance professionals really influence and flag to the board the importance of this issue?
Well, I think. Well, first and foremost, it needs to get on the board agenda, and any board that is not putting it on their agenda really needs to, rethink things. I think one of the questions for me, Philip, is how do you equip your second line, not to be cyber experts, but to have enough information to be able to ask the questions, because as I say, breakthroughs are made with questions. So I think there needs to be a lot more effort put in by, maybe the industry itself, but certainly by firms, where they're equipping the second line to be able to ask questions that will, pull these things out and, give answers that lead to more questions, which starts to, get the board more exercised in terms of what is happening. But I think unless the board is of a mindset, it's going to be very hard for the second line. But I would imagine that any CEO and certainly any executive directors I'm talking to, they are trying to make sure that the board understand that this is a real and current threat that has significant implications. So if we had a major incident, well, actually, there was an incident in the last few days. I can't imagine that there isn't a boardroom in the country not asking, well, what happened and could that happen to us?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've only got a few minutes left. Number of organisations who are small in comparison to the big four banks there. Advice and guidance to those organisations or those branches in the UK on, maybe there isn't budget, maybe there isn't spend, maybe there's no appetite to an appointed CISO, what are the recommendations of the study that support a regulated, small regulated firm?
Well, I think the issue, Philip, this is one of these cases where size doesn't matter, because the threat is there. Every financial institution has customer data. They may have outsourcing. They have all sort of vendors and things happening in their organization, and they also have if they have a problem, it can have a spill-on impact into the industry itself, even if it's just reputational. Because, whatever challenges banking has had in the last number of years, banks are still trusted to get payments right and look after your money and all those type of things. So, it's not in anyone's interest that any firm, regardless of size, has a problem. So I think it's one of these things where, small firms, big firms, mid-sized firms, they all have to deal with this issue. And, I don't know if there's an answer in terms of, a combined approach to looking at some of these things. But firms, regardless of size, are going to have to deal with cyber.
Okay. All right. I mean, that's fantastic. And so in terms of contact, can they download the report at the link below?
It's on that link there, so anyone wants to download the report, anyone wants to send follow-up questions via you, whatever, no problem.
Okay, and for all those people who are on and listening in on this, and this is part of CIRES Week, we've got a whole week of activity. Tony's kicked this off with this webinar today. We've also got a webinar tomorrow, this time tomorrow, talking about the regulator as response to cyber attacks and to cyber breaches on that, and you can certainly participate completely free of charge on that. I'll circulate the login and registration details for you to review and to socialize amongst peers as well. Also, we have a cyber resilience conference on Thursday for all bank members and regulated firm members. That is completely free of charge. There's still places left, and you'll be joining. I think we're now topping over around about 250, 260 people there as well. And we've also got a site visit care of our headline partner, BT, to walk and talk through a cyber resilience facility that they have as well there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you very much for the input, Tony, that you've have given and provided. We will definitely circulate the study. Tony's details are available on the last slide as well, but I'll also circulate his details to you directly so you can ask any questions that we haven't covered in this webinar. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, and have a great day. Thank you.